Hello, my name is Alex Iles and welcome. In today's episode we're going to be talking about the new discoveries from Yeavering in Yeavering in Northumberland, which is an Anglo Saxon royal palace. Welcome back. So I wanted to give you an update video because if you've been on the channel a while, you've noticed I've got a series on Yeavering, which is a royal palace of the Anglo Saxon kings in Northumbria in the northeast of England. So it was discovered by an archaeologist called Brian Hope Taylor, and Brian Hope Taylor did massive excavations covering the site, wrote it all up, unfortunately lost his original manuscript with all of the details of it, had to write it again, published it, and it transformed in the 1970s our understanding of the early medieval world. Prior to Brian Hope Taylor, many people, and there were a couple of other archaeologists as well around the same time in the 1970s, publishing material that really helped transform our understanding. But prior to them, the understanding of the early medieval world was that basically people lived in little mud huts, were barbaric, violent, and basically that the history was of these people living in these terrible tribal situations with, you know, the glory of Rome fading out and everyone basically just returning to primitivism until the Normans came and reasserted this idea of civilization once more. The reality was quickly upturned as the archaeology showed complex societies with massive royal palaces and also all of these other basically facets that showed that the early medieval world was far more complex than people allowed for it to be understood. And the amazing thing about Brian Hope Taylor was that he was an amazing artist as well as archaeologist. He had actually started and trained in art, and in the Second World War had been involved with a lot of the aerial photographers who were working with the British Army, who were archaeologists themselves. And so because of that, he then got interested in archaeology, got involved in it, and his drawings are some of the most amazing drawings that help us understand the early medieval world, because he was so intricate with what he actually found in the ground. He drew it perfectly and then developed it. But recently, Durham University have been digging again at Yeavering, and when they've been digging again at Yeavering, they've actually discovered that Hope Taylor made some mistakes. And these mistakes don't detract from his ability as an archaeologist, but just show that even the best of us can make problems. And he also had his set ideas, and unfortunately, when he got really stuck into his ideas, sometimes overlooked some of the facts. And so when he overlooked some of the facts, that led to mistakes that have basically resulted in the understanding of some of these sites not being as clear as they could be. And I'm going to cover some of that while we're talking right now in this episode. The first thing I want to say is he did get a lot of things right. Durham University and Sarah Stemple, who is the academic from Durham University who's been working on this, actually excavated a sunken featured building, or SFB, sometimes called Grubenhauser. And these sunken featured buildings are really interesting. They're basically Anglo-Saxon workshops, and I've also done an episode on this recently on the channel where we discuss their uses and how they were basically an important part of early medieval life. And when they got that, they got some small pieces of twigs and stuff like that they could actually carbon date. And when they carbon dated them, they've discovered that the site basically has a carbon date from about 570 AD right the way through to 650 AD. Now that is brilliant because Brian Hope Taylor himself, when he dated the site, he didn't actually use carbon dating. It was so new that he just didn't think it was worthwhile. And alongside this as well, not only did he not think it was worthwhile, but he was using Bede's ecclesiastical history. When he was using Bede's ecclesiastical history, he had Bede's narrative of basically the events of these early kings of Northumbria, of Edwin, of Oswald, of Ealhswith, and these amazing, interesting kings and the stories around them that Bede tells us about. And so he used Bede's narrative, and then he used that to basically plot the entire archaeology of the site onto Bede's narrative. Now the interesting thing is that since then, Bede's narrative has often been picked apart, and it's quite unfair in some ways, because Bede wasn't trying to create a historical book like we would expect today. You know, you think of when you sit down and read a history book, you're expecting to read facts backed up by evidence, archaeology texts, all of that stuff, and then interpreted by the historian. Now, the interesting thing about Bede is he is telling the story of how God had selected the English to bring the salvation of Christianity to the British Isles. And so it's a slightly different, it's a religious text as much as it is a historical text side by side. And so because of that, when people sometimes look at Bede and they expect pure historical fact, they can get frustrated because he doesn't always put historical fact in. He tells a narrative of his story as he's going forwards. But now that they've got these carbon dates, we can actually see that Bede's narrative actually lines up quite well with the actual archaeology in some ways, which in many ways redeems Bede, because so many people are quite harsh to Bede's narrative, and I actually find that quite amazing. Now, the interesting thing for me is that what they discovered was when they were excavating again, because last summer Durham University did an excavation, and they were focused on where the halls connected to the Great Palisade enclosure. Now, when Brian Hope Taylor was excavating, he found this enclosure. Now, the Great Palisade enclosure was interpreted as a giant cattle corral. The idea was that in the early medieval period, they did have coinage, but not to the same extent that we do today. And I know we're coming into a more digital age, so more people are paying with card now. We don't use physical cash as much as we used to. But what was happening was that coinage was starting to come in, but it was probably more amongst the elite, and it was a way of echoing Romanitas. And when they were echoing Romanitas, they wanted to show that these kings were like the Romans, that they were drawing influence from the Roman Empire and things like that, because obviously the Romans had coinage, therefore the kings wanted to show this power as well. And so rather than the normal people paying for things in coins and stuff like that, it was much more of a barter economy. And we know from documents at this time that tax was paid in 3 different ways. So you had tax in goods, so for instance cattle, food, products like wool or cloth. People would take the wool off their sheep, turn it into cloth, into tapestries, into embroidered clothing, and therefore pay their taxes through that. They would pay their taxes through food, through things like grain, barley, also meat from animals, possibly even things like milk and cheese. Those would be paid as a tax. Then you would have entertainment taxes. So for instance, if the lord or the king came through, you had to host them for a certain amount of time, and that could be another form of tax expected of an estate towards their lord or king. And the final one was taxation based upon service. So if they were building a large public monument, for instance Durham Cathedral, we know that for 1/3 of the year, from the teas right the way up to the croquette, people were expected to spend 1/3 of their year actually working on Durham Cathedral as a form of collective taxation to the church. So in the same way today, we have the military reserves, the territorial army it used to be called in Britain, but you have the military reserves. These are people who have full-time jobs but have chosen to become soldiers for a small amount of time, and they get allocated around about 40 days of service time. And then on top of that, they can get extra service if they apply for it. That actually goes back to the Middle Ages, where the king would provide for, when he summoned his lords, he would expect them to provide troops for 40 days, and then after that, the lords would have to be reimbursed for the time that their people were off the land and not providing for them. So that 40 days was expected as like service of military dues to the king. So in the same way, back then they thought that this giant cattle corral was basically where all of the sub-kings of Northumbria, or the lords, were having to pay their taxes in cattle. Because at Yeavering they discovered this building which was full of cattle skulls, and so they thought initially it was possibly a pagan temple. My thought is it's a slaughterhouse and the cattle were brought in there, and you would have your medieval basically slaughter hammer, And we have these from Pictish stones and other things like that. We've got examples, possibly even one from Sutton Hoo as well, where it's basically an axe hammer, and it's got a hammer on one side, axe on the other, and you would raise it above your head, bring it straight down on the cattle's skull, and then lights out, cattle's gone. So you would take that and basically process the cattle into beef. And then that would be a slaughterhouse. And then obviously the skull is the bit you're using the least of, so it gets chucked in a pile, and you're only there for 36 days, so it doesn't really matter. You leave, they rot down, you come back later and you continue the process at another point. So that's my view of what the building is. It's pile upon pile of cattle skulls, because each of those skulls comes from when they are feasting at the site for a short period of time, and it doesn't really matter about cleanliness too much, because you're slaughtering and killing the cattle in that building, processing the meat from it, and then it's going into another building, which was the cookhouse, which had a lovely clay floor. But what they thought was that this large palisade enclosure was where all the cattle were being kept before they were then being taken for the feasting. Now what's actually happened is they were able to find samples so they could carbon date the structure. And it was carbon dated to 1000 BC, 400 BC and 100 BC. It is a lowland hill fort. It's not actually anything to do with the rest of the early medieval site that is there at Yeavering. Now this is fascinating and amazing because it transforms our understanding of the whole site. We know that the early medieval people were attracted to prehistoric monuments. So at Yeavering as well, we know that there's Bronze Age barrows which are then transformed into burial sites. There are henges which are used for metalworking and also for a focal point at the location as well. One of them is actually inside the location of what we now know is a lowland hill fort, was both previously called the Great Palisade Enclosure. But basically what the Great Palisade Enclosure is, it's a box rampart hill fort. So you would have two sets of palisades, and then you would connect them together with a wooden walkway across the top. Then when you've got those two sets of palisades, you fill in the middle bit with earth and soil, and then you have obviously a ditch in front of it, and that creates the box palisade enclosure. So this is a lowland hill fort in the Glen Valley, near, well, the Millfield Valley, and when you've got this, it's just above the River Glen, and it makes perfect sense as a hill fort, because we know that the Iron Age Britons, and well, this would have been built roughly in the Bronze Age and then continued to be used into the Iron Age, would have basically occupied that valley because it's an incredibly fertile valley with a river running just below where the hill fort was. So I bet as they excavate and they look around there, they're going to find some Bronze Age, possibly housing, Iron Age housing, and maybe even Romano-British housing, because contemporary nearby we have other hill forts that appear to be used in the early medieval period as well. And I want to touch upon that in this episode because the whole area now becomes much more interesting. We knew that Yeavering was a multi-period site because when Brian Hope Taylor was excavating, he found Neolithic burials. And when he found these Neolithic burials, they were accompanied by Neolithic pottery and also a wonderful jet necklace that had been found probably in the early medieval period. And then there were bits of it that had been dropped as well. He describes this beautifully in his report. So when we've got this Neolithic settlements, we also find similar Neolithic settlements across at Cheviot Quarry. There's been Neolithic finds found at Furlings as well. So these are places where there's also later Anglo Saxon settlement on top of the previous Neolithic settlement. So you can see that these sites have been used over and over again. And then we've got a Bronze Age hill fort as well, which is really interesting. And then just above it, we've also got Yeavering Bell, and Yeavering Bell is a massive hill fort. It's the largest hill fort in Northumberland, and when you've got Yeavering Bell, that seems to have been used from around about 1000 BC as well, and then goes out of use later. So you've got this site down where Yeavering is, which is now known. The Great Palisade Closure is now a hill fort. We've got Yeavering Bell above it, and then nearby we've got St Gregory's Hill Fort and West Hill, both which have Romano-British settlements on top of them, which is again really interesting because they are used into the Roman period, and we know that from their shape and their style. One of them on West Hill has been described by an archaeologist as almost looking inspired by Roman villas, because the way the roundhouses are in a sort of sea-like shape. And it's basically, what he's saying is it looks a little bit like a winged villa or a winged corridor villa. So as you've seen on the channel, I've discussed villas recently. You can see that combination of where someone possibly up in Northumberland has seen these villas down in maybe County Durham, Yorkshire, something like that, and therefore has designed the part of the hill fort that they're living in to be like a villa, but using the round houses that are commonly used up in Northumberland as a basis for this. We've got loads of hill forts throughout the rest of the Millfield Valley, like Glees Kloof, Humbledon Hill, and then loads of prehistoric monuments throughout the whole area. We've got, I think, a total of 11 henges and burial mounds and all of these things going on throughout the whole of the Millfield Valley. So it's a really interesting location where this new discovery about how Ardgeffryn now looks tells us way more about the whole site, about how this Millfield Valley is continuing to be used from the Neolithic, even probably past into the Mesolithic, where we've got the Stone Age hunter-gatherers, then you go into the Neolithic with the first farmers, the Bronze Age population, where you've got the Yamna people who migrated from where roughly modern Ukraine is across Europe, basically becoming the Bronze Age population in the British Isles, who then later become the Iron Age population. And in the Iron Age we see this explosion of hill forts throughout the whole of Northumberland, especially in the upland area, of which now we know that what we thought previously was this, you know, cattle corral for the early medieval population is now a hill fort. And within a couple of 100 meters there's another lowland hill fort as well. So when these are excavated, you might actually find Romano-British buildings or settlements in and around these areas where people were basically living in the lowlands in the Romano-British period, but also interacting with the other populations who are living in the hill forts in and around the area of Yeavering Bell and the Millfield Valley. So though people could say, oh well, it proves that Brian Hope Taylor got this wrong and Brian Hope Taylor got that wrong, and you know, how can we trust these archaeologists? The whole thing about archaeology is that we are constantly advancing our knowledge. And this is why on things like Facebook or online, when the news articles come out, whenever you see a title about archaeology, 9 times out of 10 you'll see archaeologists shocked or archaeologists surprised by discovery, or this transforms our understanding of history. It should transform our understanding of history, because we've just discovered something that we didn't know, or has then reinforced or helped us to reinterpret the past in a way that we just didn't understand before. Because we're constantly finding out about how our ancestors lived, about what they did, about the world, and basically the human experience throughout time. And so I'm finding that this stuff that is going on at Yeavering up in Northumberland is really helping to understand not only the early medieval period, but also that period before that, where how were humans living in and around Northumberland, around Millfield area in that period, and how were they interacting with one another. And it's going to be really interesting again, because there's another crop mark at Mailman, slightly further along the river. And at Mailman, Bede tells us that when they finished at Ardgeffryn, they moved to Mailman, which is now Millfield in Northumberland. So when they moved there, Brian Hope Taylor and other people, when they've been looking at crop marks and aerial photography, thought they saw a second great palisade enclosure, which they thought, well, okay, they've got one great palisade enclosure at Ardgeffryn, so they must have just built a new one so that they could continue paying their cattle taxes. Well, that's probably another lowland hill fort. So if you've got another lowland hill fort over there, or possibly another feature that could be inspired in some way or similar to that, then what we're seeing is that they are situating their palaces around sites that are previously in use in the British Iron Age and in the Roman Iron Age. And so there's that continuation going on, which is really interesting, because Brian Hope Taylor's whole argument was that there was a continuation from the British population into the Anglo Saxon period, and he called Ardgeffryn an Anglo-British royal palace. So that was then thrown out of the bathwater, and it was like, no, it's fully Anglo Saxon. There's no continuation from the Britons. Now we're coming back to a point where, is there actually a continuation, because they're choosing sites that have previous importance to other populations? And so I'm loving how the fact that you have this oscillation between the theories, how you've got this layers of history, how you've got all of the different use of technologies, from aerial photography to carbon dating to excavation, that then leads us to understand the area better, and then combining that with what we know from prehistoric archaeologists, early medieval archaeologists, Iron Age archaeologists, and bring it together to get a much more complex image of human interactions and human understanding and living in this area. And so hopefully you see my passion, and that will cause you to have a passion too. As always, please have a polite conversation down in the comments section. I love to hear your thoughts, love to see what you think, and just to really develop a better understanding. As always, if you'd like to support me more, I do have a Patreon and a Ko-fi account, so if you would like to see more of this content, you can support me further just down there in the description. And alongside that as well, if you aren't already subscribed, please subscribe, because it helps the channel grow, and share these videos with your friends. As always, thank you so much for watching, and I look forward to chatting to you again in another episode in the near future. Until then, stay safe and well, and thank you very much.